Good afternoon. Welcome to today's SCA webinar with Dr. Christine Elig-Economides and Dr. Dimitrios Hazignatou on carbon neutral fuels, the value proposition. Before I introduce Dr. Elig-Economides and Dr. Hazignatou, I'd like to remind the audience that you are muted, but you can ask questions during the presentation using the GoToWebinar question feature. We will cover the questions at the end of the presentation. I'm going to start out with a few introductory slides. Dr. Elig-Economides has had an illustrious career. She started her career at Schlumberger. She's also taught at a number of universities. She's currently professor of petroleum engineering at the University of Houston, and she's the Hugh Roy and Lillian Krantz-Cullen Distinguished University Chair. She is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, has received a number of SP awards, and is an honorary member of SPE. She has degrees from Rice, University of Kansas, and Stanford. Dr. Hazignatou is also a professor in petroleum engineering at University of Houston. He has a PhD from the University of Tulsa. He's also taught at several universities, and he is currently serving on a number of different consortia and committees. He has previously served as the Chief Technical Director and Center of Oil Recovery in Norway. He's a chartered engineer and a European engineer. So the course that Dr. Elig-Economides and Dr. Hazignatou teach is called Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage. This SCA course is scheduled for November 8th through 12th in half-day sessions. It's offered live online. Houston time, that's in the morning. It may be a different time in your part of the world. And you'll hear a little sample of parts of this course today, but of course this is 5 half days, so it's a lot of material. So be sure and contact us if you're interested in registering for this course at SCA, or if you would like to have the course taught in-house at your location. We have a number of live online classes scheduled this fall. These were a new initiative brought about by COVID-19 with everyone working remotely. And so we have in September, Larry Lake and Gary Jensen on managing mature oil fields with capacitance resistance modeling. We also have in October, Amy Fox on reservoir scale geomechanics. We have John Lee on production forecasting for low permeability reservoirs at the end of October. And in November, we have Leo Rothart and Garrett Knitters on well stimulation workshop. All these classes are scheduled live online, and they are also available for in-house delivery. So turn to SCA when you have training needs or consulting, direct hire services, and projects and studies. We're available to help you with all those. Now I'm going to change the presentation rights for a moment while we conduct some polls. So we'll get those polls set up. And we'd like to learn a little bit more about our audience. And so we're going to be conducting some polls using a tool. Okay, so this is menti.com. You need to open a new browser and go to menti.com, put in the code 57031559, and you can give us 5 choices of what word comes to mind when you hear the word carbon capture. So this is real crowdsourcing to get your first impressions when we talk about carbon capture. So go to www.menti.com, type in the code 57031559. Responses are coming in now. So we see climate is a popular one. As more people vote, we will get more responses. and the size of the font will equate to how popular that answer is. So we're starting to get science fiction. Interesting. We're going to get some interesting responses. Let's see what people say. What comes to mind when you first hear carbon capture? What is the thing that resonates in your mind? Go to www.menti.com, type in the code 57031559, and you can start to put your responses. So Christine, have you conducted this experiment with others? Is this the first time you've tried this? Okay, so this is interesting for all of us. You're guinea pigs. Okay, we've got some more answers. We've got, that seems to be the most popular at the moment, the largest font size. We've got important to do. All right, global warming, environment. So far, we've got 13 responses and we have 37 into our webinar. So hopefully you can figure out how to go to menti.com, open a new browser, and use the code 57031559. And you can put in as many as 5 words about what you think about when you hear carbon capture.
Susan, this slide only allows 1. The next slide is 5. Sorry.
So maybe we do have responses from 14 people at this point. So this is, that's very helpful. Thank you, Mary. So we're still getting choices, but so far environment, CO2, and global warming are the most popular. Maybe we can go to the next, Mary, and we can come back to this one in a minute as people continue to enter their answers. Okay, so the next question, this one is where you get 5 choices. So go to the same code, 57031559, and your question is, what are the 5 most valuable uses for fossil resources? And the hint, what are the most valuable uses? So this is a webinar on carbon neutral fuels, the value proposition. So we're looking for value. Transportation. Got 1 answer so far. Power generation. Electricity generation. Clothing, materials, fertilizer, fuel. Lots of answers. So far, transportation seems the one that most people are selecting because it's showing up with the biggest font. We're continuing to get answers. So this is more dynamic. With 5 answers, we get more choices. Okay. Well, I think this gives us a good start for our presentation. Maybe we can revisit these at the end of the hour and see if the popular choices have changed. But it looks like on this one, certainly transportation is the one that's continuing to hold the lead for the most valuable use for fossil fuel resources. So I'm going to go ahead and change the presentation rights to Christine. And Christine, we will let you take over the presentation.
So are we showing my slide?
Yep, you can put it in show mode and you're ready to go. Great.
All right, and we're going to see about that laser pointer, I think. Okay, all right, looks good. Well, thank you, all of you, for joining the webinar today. I'm so excited to offer you this, and I hope it will give you a good taste for what the course may be about. Apologies for my colleague, Dr. Hatzignatiu, had to schedule a doctor's appointment today, and we didn't expect this. With a little luck, he may be able to join us in time for the Q&A. So this is just a quick look at what we planned for the 5-day course. And today we'll focus on a little bit about morning 2, morning 3, and we're talking value. So we got to get to morning 5. So just a taste. All right, so that's our title. And this relates to the second question that you were looking at. And you did pretty well on this, actually, because if you look on the right, we can see what are the products in a crude oil barrel. And you can see that the most of the crude oil barrel is actually going to gasoline, then diesel. And then we have other combustible items like the heating oil, kerosene and jet fuel. This is bunker fuel for ships. So when you add it all up, 83%, according to this source, of the crude oil barrel is going to products that are combusted. And materials, some of you mentioned materials and petrochemicals, so good for you. And so these are the fractions of the barrel going to that, so a total of about 17%. And I just went to the web and tried to get estimated costs for these items. It's a little hard to generalize these, so these are not precise what we're saying here, but I think they're conveying the right impression. So if we look at the total value for the products in the barrel, it looks like around nearly $360. And think about that when you think about what we get for the upstream price per barrel. But look at this, the combustible products make up less than $100 of that, and material products almost $260. So to summarize, material products make up more than 72% of the value in a crude oil barrel. And the combustible products that give us transportation are 83% of the crude oil volume. But that 83% doesn't bring the biggest value. All right, I'm going to now go back to the hydrocarbon resource triangle. I wish I could ask for a show of hands how many of you have seen this from Dr. Steve Holditch. Don't we miss him? But it's a good place to start here, just as a reminder. And so at the top of the triangle, we see the conventional reservoirs occupying a small part of the triangle area. And of course, everything is relative, but these are relatively smaller volumes, and they're easier to develop than the unconventional reservoirs that have become so prominent in North America. So these represent very large volumes, but they require a lot of technology. And so we really need a higher price to enable their production. And at the bottom of the resource triangle, still for the future, but already in study, we can see natural gas hydrates, and we can see Carrington oil shale. Both of them rather solid-like in the subsurface. So we're going to look at two carbon neutral fuels today. First, we'll look at carbon neutral crude oil, and then second, we'll look at blue hydrogen. So starting from the carbon neutral fuel, we need to define what's meant by this. And so we want to take care of all the greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. So we need to eliminate all the greenhouse gas leaks. And in the first question, I didn't see methane, but methane is a very important greenhouse gas to pay attention to. And we'll see that on the next slide as well, just how important. And then we're going to make sure we emit no greenhouse gas as well by capturing and storing all those combustion greenhouse gases that we saw are 83% of what the crude oil barrel represents. So people talk about scopes, And here we can see scope 1 is in the upstream, scope 2 goes on in the midstream, and here's a little bit different number, but these are the combustions. And we can see that scope 3 is a very important element in what we're talking about today. So this slide coming from the IEA does a nice job of summarizing the same elements that you saw on the previous slide. So color coordinated for energy and extraction, that's the upstream. Flaring, darker blue, methane in the green, transport of the crude oil, refining, and products transport. And what we're looking at is kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel of oil equivalent. And that's an important thing to realize because we see methane looking very prominent here. And I bet all of you are thinking, oh, I don't think so. We don't leak that much methane, no way. And I agree with you. But the global warming potential for methane is about 30 times that of CO2. And this is CO2 equivalent. So if you scale down the green, the pale green, to 1 in 30, then it doesn't look so prominent on here. But it needs to be prominent if we're worried about the greenhouse gas effects. So we can see that there's a lot of emissions from the refining as well, and you can see kind of the others. But here's something for you to notice. This is excluding all the scope 3 emissions. We're looking at what goes on in scope 1 and scope 2, nothing to do with the combustion products. Here's something else that we need to be very aware of in this subject of CCS and CCUS. If we talk about storing the CO2 from coal-fired power generation, I think it's interesting to notice this, that if we start with a cubic meter of coal and combust it to make it carbon dioxide, it's now 8 times the volume that the coal originally occupied. And then we're going to store it in porosity. So if we go with an average porosity of 20%, then that's a 5 times multiplier. And then if we at least get the CO2 dissolved in brine, if we're going to talk about storing in an aquifer, then that's a multiplier of times 50. Now, of course, a nice thing to do would be to use the CO2 for EOR, and this rectangle represents the fraction that is really available for that, at least in North America. So we've got a 200 multiplier on the bulk volume required in the subsurface if we're talking storage of CO2 from coal-fired power. Now, the oil picture is a bit better because oil already starts from porosity. So the carbon dioxide is a little less dense and requires a bit more space than the oil. So it's a factor of about 2.3, the increase in the space required to manage CO2 from oil. But natural gas is rather friendly on this score because it also starts from porosity. And if we consider the carbon dioxide resulting from combusting the methane, it actually takes only about 2/3 of the pore space of the methane that came from the reservoir. So I think this is a very interesting thing to keep in mind today. On the right, just a little table showing something about how many tons of CO2 can you store per acre foot. And if you're just talking about bulk injection, then the problem is that if you're talking aquifers, water is not very compressible. And so you just can't put very much CO2 per acre foot if all you're going to do is shove it into pore space that's already occupied by water. But if instead you displace the same volume of brine from the aquifer as you inject as CO2, as is done for the Gorgon project in Australia, then you see we get a lot more CO2 stored. And regarding pressurized, what's been done here is to pressurize to about 5% of the fracturing pressure. So if you consider pressurizing the reservoir over its initial reservoir pressure, then indeed you can get a bit more stored. The other thing that's really important about all this is if we're going to talk about CCS and CCUS, we need the CO2. Where's it going to come from? And this is looking at US CCS cost by point source in dollars per ton of CO2. And this study came out at the end of 2019 from the National Petroleum Council. And what we see here are just many, many cases that they looked at. And these were 80% of the stationary point source emissions in the US. We can see that this is a small fraction. Well, it's a significant fraction, but it's certainly not the total of all the US emissions. And what we see is that these costs go steeply up and they eventually get to nearly $300 per ton of CO2. And different sorts of capture are have different costs. So these three examples give you an idea of that. So a great way to get the CO2 is from ethanol, corn ethanol plants. Cement plants are pretty good. Are more expensive than the ethanol. And then natural gas power plants still more. And so the pink here is the capture cost in dollars per ton. And what we see is that what petroleum engineer core skills consider average is around $20 per ton. So the problem is not the cost of what we might do as petroleum engineers. The problem is how much it costs to get CO2 from stationary point source. So there is a government provision, a tax credit called 45Q. And this is just marking what that can offer. And you can see that many of these cases, most of these cases are way more expensive than 45Q. So that's not going to balance these capture costs. So going back to the hydrocarbon resource triangle, my focus now is going to tight oil, the low perm oil. We're talking oil like what you get out of Permian Basin today in the resource plays, or up in North Dakota, or Eagle Ford, so the tight oil. And I want to focus your attention for a moment on how associated gas is used. And this is another graphic coming from the IEA. And these are by region. So we can see that in North America, much of the associated gas is making it to a market. We also use it on site, so it can be used to power drilling or hydraulic fracturing or re-injected. Certainly offshore, it's a lot of re-injection. And then we've got, unfortunately, flared and really, unfortunately, vented. So this is the associated gas produced with the oil. And you can see that overall, North America venting is small, and it's worse in other parts of the world. But again, let me remind you that this is methane. So venting methane is a severe greenhouse gas issue. So an interesting idea is, especially for this tight oil, is to use the associated gas to power direct air capture of CO2 from the atmosphere. So when I started thinking about this, the percent of associated gas being flared in Texas was a lot higher than it is today. but we are still flaring quite a lot. And why do we flare? Because it's stranded, because we haven't found a market, and it's more than we can use for the upstream operations. And so the reported costs for capture are from $100 to $140 per ton of CO2, but this depends on the cost of the natural gas you're going to use. And if this is stranded, otherwise flared, then we're going to use it at a very low cost. So I would suggest it should cost about the same as the cost of gathering gas for gas lift. So while this does cost less than many of the point source captured reported on the NPC, remember those are going up to nearly $300 per ton. They are more expensive than some of the nature-based negative emissions. However, what I think is really nice about this idea, they require usually a smaller land print than the nets, and I think it's far more verifiable. So a couple of cases here. We're looking at first here the case of carbon neutral crude oil for storage in say a saline aquifer. So the idea is we'll capture and store the same mass of CO2 that would be generated through the combustion of the crude oil products. And what's going on here is that the tight oils are really gassy. They have a lot of associated gas. And so what I learned is they have enough associated gas that you can remove enough CO2 with a DEC unit to cover the combustion. And so when you take into account the lower cost of the fuel, which is otherwise stranded associated gas, we can bring this DAC unit cost down, the lowest cost. And what I'm finding is that you can produce the CO2 for about $1.16 an MCF, and they use CO2 for EOR, especially in Permian Basin, at about $1.50 per MCF. So that's getting interesting. And my estimates is that this is about $3 per barrel more than whatever is your current sales price, or for the consumers, 25 to 30 cents per gallon. So we add that to the crude oil or the gas tank price. And this is including the $20 per ton, or rule of thumb, 20 cents per gallon for transportation and geologic storage. But even more interesting, why don't we sell that CO2 to the people doing EOR in the Permian Basin? And if you do that, you're essentially at break even. Pretty interesting. So if we look at a comparison here between the largest conventional reservoirs. So this is, I think, the top 100 conventional reservoirs. So each of those have a blue dot here. And then also added to the plot in a different color, this red color, are the unconventional reservoirs. And so what's being plotted here is the solution gas oil ratio reported, and then cumulative oil volumes that are being produced or are expected to be produced from these various fields. And so an interesting observation is that many of the fields that you know, their solution GOR is too low, because we need on the order of about 3,500 SCF per stock tank barrel to cover CO2 from combustion using a direct air capture unit. So now you're looking at it and saying, well, conventional is not high enough either. But here's the difference. These major conventional fields, they're going to stay on water flood. So they're never going to let the produced gas oil ratio get above the solution gas oil ratio, whereas the unconventionals are produced in primary. So the actual produced GORs are much higher than the solution GORs, and that's why it works. And so look at this. I would say tight oil has the advantage over big oil. Fancy that. And a few more things that make this idea attractive. No change in the downstream crude oil refining and projects use. New jobs for petroleum engineers on the storage side. It doesn't worry us about whether we're going to continue to have crude oil for petrochemical products, but it does still leave us with urban pollution that our internal combustion engine vehicles have associated with nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, and volatile organic carbons. And just to remind, we're talking about using the associated gas from light crude oil. And lest you think I'm fantasizing, this was the headline in early June. So Occidental supplied the first cargo of carbon neutral crude to India's Reliance, 2 million barrels shipped to India. So Occidental has found a market for this. I don't know what they sold it for, but it just seems to me this is a value product. I'm going to switch now, and we're going to have a look at blue hydrogen as a second carbon neutral fuel. And the blue hydrogen is going to come from natural gas. So let's talk a moment about hydrogen economy. And some of you may remember back during the second Bush administration, the hydrogen economy ideas. And this graphic comes from that time frame. And what we notice on the left is there's no fossil energy there. And remember the question that you answered about uses for fossil energy. Look around the edge of this. You know, this is claiming that you're going to get all those things, maybe not all of them that you listed, but many of them from hydrogen. And that hydrogen is going to come from renewable energy. So wind and solar and water. And no fossil allowed. And how are we going to get the hydrogen? We're going to take electricity from those renewables and electrolyze it to get the hydrogen. And then how we use it in fuel cells. So what was the rationale at the time for this, at least in the United States? So this is a quote from a press release. President Bush's $1.2 billion hydrogen fuel initiative aims to reverse America's growing dependence on foreign oil by accelerating commercialization of hydrogen-powered fuel cells to power cars, trucks, homes, businesses with no pollution or greenhouse gas. So this was about the concern at the time that nearly 60% of the used crude oil in the United States was being imported, and that this was this energy security issue. Furthermore, through partnerships with the private sector, the Hydrogen Fuel Initiative and Freedom Car will make it practical and cost-effective for large numbers of Americans to choose to use clean hydrogen fuel vehicles by 2020. We didn't get there. Let's do a reality check on that. This is 2020. This is a reality in 2020. And so what is our mixture for energy? It's petroleum, natural gas, and coal. We do have a pretty good wedge of renewable energy, but it's nowhere near covering all the energy like the vision we just saw. And that vision didn't even include nuclear. So this slide fits very well with what we understand. And just a little more, natural gas has a strong future, it looks like. So here, this is a very busy slide, and we don't want to dwell on it too long, but it's just looking at capacity mix and electricity. And these are all taking emissions to zero. So starting from 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, taking it to zero. This is electricity focused, of course. And so you can see the wind in green and the solar in yellow. You will notice that as you go to the low cost, which is what we see on the right. So high cost on the left of each graph, lower cost on the right. Left graph includes some baseload power generation from hard infrastructure like nuclear and natural gas. The one on the right tries to do it all with renewable. And look what happens here. It takes twice as much capacity to do it all with renewable. So a couple points here. Renewable takes way more capacity than what you can do if we keep using some of the other power choices. And the lowest cost option is going to keep natural gas in that picture. Of course, the natural gas here is with CCS, so this is decarbonized natural gas. So let's talk about the blue hydrogen. So people talk about different kinds of hydrogen by color. So when you hear people talk about green hydrogen or yellow hydrogen, they mean coming from solar or solar and wind. So renewable is green. If it's red, pink, or purple, that's nuclear. The blue hydrogen comes from natural gas with CCS. If we make hydrogen from methane reforming, but don't capture the CO2, that's gray hydrogen. If we form it through partial combustion, we get solid carbon. That is a turquoise hydrogen, and you can make hydrogen from coal. So there's black hydrogen and brown hydrogen. And all of these can be decarbonized except gray. Gray is releasing CO2. So how do we do the blue hydrogen? I like this one to kind of explain that. So we have the methane reforming. If all we do is the methane reforming and release the CO2 to the atmosphere, that's the gray. If we reform and if we use or produce blue hydrogen for the reforming, then this is absolutely decarbonized. So this is what some people call pre-combustion capture. So we'll store the CO2 from that underground. Or the green over here, we have electricity from renewable sources plus water, and we get hydrogen and release only oxygen. So an interesting point is that the blue hydrogen requires half as much water as green hydrogen. Could be important in some parts of the world. So looking at costs of hydrogen generation, what we see here is that blue hydrogen at the moment is a little more expensive than gray hydrogen and far less expensive than yellow or green hydrogen from electrolysis using wind and solar. So maybe in the future, these will get less expensive, but for the moment, blue hydrogen looks like a wonderful choice. And as to how much natural gas is there to do this, as much as you want. I'm sure there's 1,000 years of blue hydrogen. You can look at both of these and see that point. How can you use hydrogen? You can use it for transportation. You can use it for industrial processes, or you could use it for combined cycle electricity generation. And this is, again, amazing to see that the costs for the blue hydrogen are the black, and they're already less than, that would be decarbonized, carbonized natural gas generation today. Now this is in the low capacity part of power generation. So that's what happens when the wind stops blowing and we go to the peak units. So this is your peaking power over here. So this is a very realistic idea to be thinking about hydrogen for transportation and power. Now, just a little bit about the infrastructure story. So regarding hydrogen transport, this graphic is kind of hard to follow, but it's showing you that for nearly all hydrogen flow rates and for all the distances covered in this up to 500 kilometers, your first choice is pipeline. And on the right, we see that parts of the United States are very well covered with a natural gas pipeline network. So we might be thinking about produce natural gas, pipeline it near where you want to dispense it for transportation, and then do the methane reforming there, and hopefully store the CO2 there. So there's a very interesting problem in figuring out the best way to do all that. Hydrogen storage, people do worry about it because, and pipelines as well, because of the possibility of steel embrittlement. So there's a lot of research going on other ways to store hydrogen, but it's already stored today. And so the green locations that you see here are actual hydrogen storage. And people look at the possibility of storing hydrogen also in methane reservoirs. Furthermore, this graphic is showing you places where hydrogen is stored, and high concentration hydrogen is a US thing. It's a Gulf Coast thing, and you can see those locations again here. But this one is also showing possible locations for the future for hydrogen storage. Pipelines, they exist. So yes, we have to pay attention to the possibility of leaks because of embrittlement, but industry is already doing this. And this is just a nice reminder, going back to the NPC report. The blue hydrogen CO2 capture is actually less than the 45Q tax credit, and the carbon neutral crude oil DAC is just a little over it. So these are pretty reasonable ideas. So I'm just about at the end, and I want to take you back to Hefner's papers, and some of you may have seen him talk about this, but it just looks so prophetic when it came out. But looking at the way solids, especially coal, have been declining in the energy mix. This is percent of the total energy mix. Oil coming up may be declining according to the data up to 2000, and natural gas on the rise. So of course this is dated. This was done in 2000, but the forecast is that methane continues to grow. So this is our natural gas picture, while crude oil and coal continue to decline. And ultimately we get to the pure hydrogen vision, maybe all of it becoming renewable. But look at the beautiful bridge that natural gas and blue hydrogen can build to enable that green hydrogen future if we ever get there. So now I have a little quiz for you. And so we're going to take this through the, what do you call it?
You can put it in the chat.
In the chat, yeah. So Susan's going to tell us what you're suggesting these are. So I'll just pause and see what you guys come up with.
I won't, your guesses will be anonymous. You can go ahead and type your guesses in the chat as to what these molecules are if you have one. You've stumped them. No answers.
No
Who
answers.
wants to guess? You may have to tell us the answer. No one is willing to guess.
I'm not telling. We're going to go to the next slide. All right. What's the background then?
So on Christine's slide deck, what is this slide background showing? What molecule is been on the entire slide deck? Any guesses? All quiet from our audience. They are not guessing. I promise you'll be anonymous. I won't say who it is that's guessing.
We don't have any chemists in the crowd.
I guess not.
All right, well, here we go.
So the background on all the slides has been coal.
It's coal, and it's not all of coal. We need to just keep growing that same molecule, sort of like it for the whole wall behind you or behind me or wherever, and that'll approach what coal represents as a molecule. All right, so
we
let's.
received one guess, hydroxylize.
Oh, that's a fancy idea. Okay, so we were just going to return back to the, I don't know if my slides are showing right now or what's showing, because I see me.
Yes, yes, your slides are showing.
Okay, so this is just a reminder about the content of the course, and I hope this has excited some of you. I think we're going to look at it with a little different perspective that some may. I think the day of focusing only on CO2 storage from coal is way past this. The petroleum industry is taking a lot more interest in this, and the focus here is to encourage the idea that you can roll that storage into valued products. And so the message here is the 45Q is a good help, but this is not dependent on carbon tax, what I'm talking about. So let's see, last slide was just back to remind about SCA, and we hope this has been inspiring for you. All right, so I'll take the slides off, and we'll open for Q&A.
Yeah, we'll be happy to take your questions. I want to remind you that you are muted in the audience, but you can ask your questions using the GoToWebinar question feature. Just type your questions there and I will read them. So first, Christine, you noted that I think it was 72% of the value of hydrocarbon comes from the material rather than the combustible products. And in many cases, we see associated gas that's being vented or flared or used on site, not being sold. Do you anticipate a time in the future where that might also be the case? Some of the products that we are only selling the combustible products.
Actually, since I did engineering, I have heard chemical engineers claim exactly the complement of what Susan asked, that if they had their way, we'd use the whole barrel for products, for material products, and not the combustible products. So stop the combustion and go to the materials. I think this is an interesting challenge because the products we're talking about, I think if any of you just look around your environment, where you're watching this webinar, I bet you within hand's reach, there are a dozen products that are coming from that crude oil barrel, that 17% of the crude oil barrel. And they are worth, for sure, more value. So the question is, if we are migrating away from using crude oil for transportation, remember, most of you thought transportation is what we use fossil energy for. If we're really going to electric vehicles, or I would say hydrogen vehicles are a great choice, then are we going to abandon the crude oil? And then where are we going to get what we need to make these other value products, material products? Or are the downstream people, the petrochemical people, going to find a way to use that more than 80% of the barrel that's currently combusted for other material products? So a little bit different answer, Susan, from what you asked.
Good.
I hope okay.
Good discussion. Next question. Are you familiar with the DOE NETL carbon safe initiatives? Have you worked on any, and does your extended class talk about any DOE NETL projects?
Yeah, I have not personally worked on any of those, but I have kept an eye on them, and definitely we'll want to refer to some of that in the class.
Very good. Next question. Should the energy sector focus more on carbon capture or carbon geologic storage?
The thing is, petroleum engineers would rather focus on storage because that's our core skill. But the reason I'm bringing up about the capture is if nobody is paying to capture that CO2, then we don't have any business in storing the CO2. I like the content of this lecture because it isn't so reliant on spending money to capture out of point source, stationary point sources. It's all cost. We saw that, and it's not small, it's big cost. So we have to worry about this capture cost. If we're going to, if CO2 storage is going to be a major factor in reducing the greenhouse gases for global warming, then we have to see it captured. Otherwise, I don't know, wait for the renewables, but don't hold your breath.
So next question, on slide 11, you spoke about the CO2 in brine with a multiplier of 50 and an EOR, a multiplier of 200. Could you talk a little bit more about what these multipliers mean?
Yeah, sure. So the 50 is just that CO2, the most CO2 you can dissolve in water is about 2%. So that's a 50 multiplier. So it's a big task to find enough brine storage for CO2 if we're talking about dissolved. Now, ultimately, we'd even like to see it mineralized, but mineralized is talking millennia, the time frame to see that happen. But the dissolution is somewhat faster, still, I think, centuries. So that's where that's coming from. Now, regarding how you can get way more CO2 in the saline aquifers it's an analog between primary and secondary oil production, and it's the same thinking, but on the injection side. So again, primary oil production, we just drill the well, produce the oil, and we don't support pressure. So the problem with primary is you need to keep infill drilling because your wells go on decline. So the same thing will happen if you inject CO2 without doing anything to maintain the pressure in the other way, which means take something out. So for oil, to get more oil, we can support pressure by injecting water. So for CO2, to store more CO2, we can take the brine out, same volume as you put CO2 in. So we keep the pressure the same. And now we are able to put CO2 in place of the water. So that's the concept there. And again, the Gorgon project actually does this. So I think the implied, the implication here is that it may be easier to produce brine than it is to store the captured CO2. We did a paper a little while back, though. An idea is desalinate produced brine. So now you get another product, which is fresh water, and only store back the concentrated brine. So there are interesting ideas, and it's very similar to why we get so much more % of oil out of the ground when we go to water flood than we can get with primary.
Next question. A recent paper by Haworth and Jacobson indicated that blue hydrogen had a minimal CO2 emissions reduction versus gray hydrogen or even hydrocarbon combustion. The argument was that lots of CO2 is emitted by natural gas production anyway, and underground sequestration is unproven. Have you seen their paper, and if so, what do you think? Haworth and Jacobson.
I sure have seen that paper. And it's a very important piece of work. I don't buy it completely, but they managed to bring it to the attention of New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and other press releases. This is very unusual for academic papers, so I'm not sure exactly what was behind that, but those authors have done this before. If you look at the paper, do a search on assume and assumption, because they're making a lot of assumptions, and their claims are really not based on data. They're based on assumptions. A big one is, let's just assume that every time you do anything with natural gas, 3.5% of it leaks. And that's not based on data. That's an out of the air number as far as I can tell. And it's not new. They've been saying this kind of thing before. So I don't agree necessarily with their alarmist conclusions, but I do see that it's critical if we're going to be able to defend the idea of blue hydrogen, that we are completely aware of methane leaks and how to avoid them. I probably am talking too long here, but I think it's very important to pay attention how much of methane leaks are from dry gas reservoirs, so reservoirs that are gas in the ground, and how much of it has to do with associated gas from oil. And this goes back to the venting. So if a lot of the methane releases currently being detected, say on satellite, are really to do with oil, we need the oil to clean up their act, because they could be destroying the future for blue hydrogen.
Great. Next question. Have your economic slides included any costs up to $20 million for a Class 6 permit from the EPA to sequester CO2? And then he goes on to say this is an injection well permit, a Class 6 permit.
Yes, the $20 per ton is just coming from a source that does take that into account. It's a great question, though. It's a really important question. So the economics of storing CO2, especially in North America, are quite scary. And I think that if this is going to become a business in directions like what I'm outlining, we're going to have to see if this can be a bit more realistic on these requirements. For example, you need the Class 6 well if you are bulk ejecting, but if you are doing CO2 EOR, you can inject the CO2 without the Class 6 well. And it's, to me, quite unclear when it becomes considered storage if you've never put a Class 6 well. So these questions are super important, and we'll definitely be looking at them in the class.
Excellent. Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I think that's all the questions we have time for today. Be sure and sign up for Christine's class to ask her more questions. Thanks for attending today's webinar. Later today, you'll receive a link to the recording of today's webinar, an evaluation form, and a link to registration details for Dr. Ilig Economides and Dr. Dimitrios Hazagnatou's class on carbon capture utilization, which is offered November 8th through 12th in 5 half-day sessions live online. Goodbye.